All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining in today. My name is Bert Mandelbaum. I am the chair of the New Jersey AAP Task Force on Adolescent Sleep and School Start Times. And it is my pleasure to welcome you guys here. This webinar hosted by and sponsored by the New Jersey AAP will be the second part of a series really focusing today on implementing healthy school hours to prioritize student well-being. We are very lucky today that we have three panelists who are all members of the educational system and all are at varying kind of degrees have participated in school districts who have changed their school start times. And so we wanted to bring that discussion to you to talk about why they're doing it, how they did it, what the benefits have been, what some of the obstacles have been for them. So without further ado, I want to get right into it. And it is my pleasure to introduce. We have three panelists today. So three friends of ours, Dr. Ken Batchelor, the superintendent from Radnor in Pennsylvania, Jessica Caruso Baxter, who is a principal at Randolph, but was at Princeton High School as they changed their school start times, and Dr. Michael LaSousa, who is the superintendent at Chatham. And as I said, I am Bert Mandelbaum. And we'd like to open just by giving each of our panelists a couple of minutes just to talk about who they are and their experience before we get into a very brief overview of the science and right into a discussion of the topic. So Dr. Batchelor, thank you for being here. I'll turn it to you first.
All right, thank you so much. And it's my pleasure to be here to join the state of New Jersey and all of the administrators and community members that are part of this to talk about this really important topic. I've been the superintendent of Radnor Township School District. This is going into my 6th year. Prior to this, I was at a previous district where I was the assistant superintendent, and I was asked to lead a committee discussing this topic. And I stand in front of you today as someone who is at first very skeptical of this, very skeptical as somebody who was a former high school lacrosse coach, who in the off season, I open up the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning to have the kids work out. I've always been a morning person all my life. So when initially I was asked to lead a group in a previous district about this, I was skeptical. I came here to Radnor and this has been a topic in the community for many years. And we decided we need to make a decision. We need to just make a decision whether this change is going to be right for us or not, but we're going to study it and make a decision. When I first started here in Radnor, I had the opportunity to go on a national conference, and I'm meeting with superintendents and I'm asking them, what is your greatest legacy? Some of them who were preparing to retire. And I was sitting with a superintendent from California who told me his greatest legacy was school start time change and the impact it had on the community. And at that time, this was about 5 years ago, 6 years ago or so, we hadn't made the change here in Radnor. We were studying it. And I walked away from the conversation thinking to myself, really? School start time? That's his biggest legacy. I hope when I retire, many years down the road that, I don't know that that's going to be my legacy moment. Fast forward, Radnor did a study. We moved our high school start time, changed it by an hour. And I understand now why that superintendent told me that school start time was his greatest legacy. I have become not only a believer, I have seen the impact it has had on our climate and our culture, the impact it has had on our kids. I'm also a father of 6 with 3 out of the house now, 3 still in the house, 2 in high school. So at the same time I was going through this, I was watching my own kids and their friends as well. This one change of changing school start times has such a dramatic impact on the kids and the climate. Seeing us do it here at Radnor and watching the impact of it has made me become not only a believer in the power that this can have, but that that we need to be looking at this as one of the most critical health issues facing our high schoolers. So I thank you for having me here. I'm happy to join in the conversation and talk more about some of the details and how we did it at Radnor.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Batchelor. Jessica, let's go to you. So Jessica Baxter from Randolph, who was at Princeton.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. as Dr. Mandelbaum said, I was at Princeton High School, and in 2018, we did introduce a later start time, which was 8:20. And I come at this from a different perspective. We didn't start the conversation with a later start time. We had a lot of students, and we were noticing a wellness issue. Our students were very overwhelmed, overscheduled, and really their health was suffering. So we did a survey, and we found out that they were getting reporting the majority of our students, grades 9 through 12, reporting fewer than 6 hours of sleep a night. And we saw the results as they were coming to school. We used to call it the zombie walk in the morning. So we were looking at how to restructure our entire school day and our schedule. We landed at a later start time based on all the research, and we implemented it for a year and a half before we went out for the pandemic, and we saw nothing but positive results. And I say, if you ever tried to go to Princeton and take back a later start time and move earlier, not only would the students not like it, I don't think our families and our teachers would like it either, because I think they all notice the benefits. And like Dr. Batchelor, I also am a morning person, and though I fully participated in the committee and I was fully committed to going to a later start time, I thought I would not like it. And I really will say, as a morning person, I enjoyed the extra time at home in the morning with my family. And then having a nice school day with the kids, and we know such a positive impact on the students, their attendance, their engagement, and just their overall health and well-being. So that's why I'm here as part of the conversation on why to do it and how to do it, and just glad to be here. So thank you.
And thank you, Principal Baxter. And last but certainly not least, Dr. LaSousa.
Thank you, Dr. Mandelbaum, and thank you to everyone joining us today and for having me on the panel. I have about 25 years in the business, and most of them have been here in Chatham. I came here to Chatham in 2001 as a teacher, a high school teacher, ultimately became high school principal, and then the past 11 years I've been superintendent of schools. I actually don't know exactly how, but I became acquainted with the research around adolescent sleep patterns and the health and science of sleep early on in my principalship. And the first meeting that I held about trying to start high school later was in 2008 as high school principal. The conversation went nowhere fast, and the change was much bigger than I could possibly undertake as a building level administrator. So from time to time over the next 14 years, basically, I would bring up the subject. We would talk about it here and there. I would lament the fact that the single worst thing we were doing as a public school district was starting our high school day at 7:40 a.m. And I couldn't really get much done until literally like the month before the pandemic hit. We had some momentum at the Board of Education and district level to really seriously try to roll up our sleeves and make a change. And the reason for that at the time was, like Jessica was sharing, we had been surveying our students about their health habits beginning in about 2014, 2015. And we were seeing, of course, what everyone has seen, which is a rise in a number of mental health concerns, including a lack of sleep. And we had noticed actually from 2015 straight through 2019, students were reporting sleeping less as the years went on. So we were on the precipice then. We had the pandemic. And then really, as soon as we came out of the pandemic, we got back to work. And the pandemic was a gift to us here in our school district because it enabled us to think a little bit differently about school. And I think it softened some of the viewpoints about, in particular, how high school students can self-direct and be responsible for their learning and continue learning online if they're not physically present in a school. And ultimately that led to a year ago making the change to, or committing to the change to a later start time, which we implemented this year. We opened schools this year on August 25th. Starting the school year earlier actually was another thing related to student health and well-being. We thought that was better for the mental health of our students overall. So we began August 25th. We're about 8 weeks in now, and so far the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. So I'm happy to participate today, and I thank you again for having me.
So thank you to you guys. And there are some themes here that we're going to tackle. You know, the wellness theme that you guys discussed is why we kind of talk about this as a public health issue. And the fact that really we're at a point where we're kind of cresting in terms of our knowledge, experience, and the new understanding that there's different ways not only to educate students, but that districts can do big things quickly. And the pandemic kind of taught us that. So let's get into what we're going to talk about today. And so we'll go into kind of some of the perceived obstacles. We'll talk about the strategies. We'll talk about creative solutions. We'll talk about how to discuss this with the community and what the impact is. But before we get into any of that, it's hard to have these conversations and discuss this without understanding the priority that this is a public health issue. And what I hope to convince people is that, there is often when we do these conversations, we initially start with the why, that there's the science, and then we get into the how. The how is what we'll focus on today. But too often in the past, it's almost been like the how was on a seesaw was so overwhelming that outweighed everything else. And what I want to convince you is that this, as the priorities, this is really a public health issue. This really will impact positively across the board for kind of in a multifaceted way for your students, and that the impact, although it requires mitigation strategies, are doable, they're minimal, and by no means do they match the benefits of the health benefits to students. So let's go into this. So again, very briefly, here's the why. And at the end of this, we did a webinar about a month ago that really dove into the why. So we'll have a link to that. So for people who want to hear more about this, that'll be there for you. But let's start with, nobody ever said that education was better for adolescents at 7:20 in the morning, never mind with the concept that they're getting up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning. It really was a transportation issue. And historically, it was not there forever. This is really a problem that started in the 70s, moved into the 80s, but it is not how we kind of traditionally educated students if we go back more than one generation. And really where we are, we have to understand that, because we are now just understanding the kind of difficulties with that educational process, and we have to figure out how to unwind it. The second issue to remember is that adolescents, though kind of can be mature in body, their brains are still developing, and so they are not just young adults, and that this is really a critical time for brain development requiring sleep. And we know, you guys alluded to this, but the mental health issues, just in the context of wellness, but really mental health issues, have really been an issue over the last decade and have only been getting worse. And we are not making the case that this is the cause of it. We are just making the argument that this is one solution that will positively impact everyone by getting them more sleep, to be kind of implemented along with other solutions. And that's how we'll help to kind of stem the kind of tide of mental health issues. You can't buy into this if you don't buy into the fact that sleep is critical, and that really is what this is all about. So this is a sleep deprivation issue. Adolescents need 9 hours. They definitely need at least 8. And as Jessica said, almost anytime in New Jersey, if you survey your adolescents and try to get accurate counts on how much they're sleeping, it's probably give or take 6 hours. A bunch of reasons for that, and one of them I'll show you, but it is when we make them get up for school, and that lack of sleep impacts everything. So in our other ones, we go into this in more detail, and if anyone has heard me talk, we really dive into, there's so many studies now looking at how sleep impacts adolescents. So it impacts learning. We know that that educational retention of material is much worse. We know that lack of sleep impacts depression rates, impacts suicidality. We know it impacts automobile accidents and therefore kind of deaths from that. We know that it impacts heart disease, obesity, and growth. We know that it impacts substance use, sexual risk-taking, and that it increases sports injuries. And the unbelievable thing is that we know that when we get them more sleep, it makes all of those things better. It improves grades, it improves attendance, it improves educational retention of material, it improves sports performance, and it decreases mental health issues. So why are we talking about this? And there is one biological fact that you need to understand. So we know that there's lots of things that drive kids to stay up late. And we're not at all kind of not paying attention to that. But a lot of those are outside of the school district. We could do education on them for families, but they're not allowing, kids were not able to go to sleep before 10:30 or 11 as a teenager in general, because they have this normal physiological shift in their circadian rhythms. So if you haven't heard this before, this is the thing you need to remember. It is not their fault. And this is true kind of across the country. This is true, this is not something new since iPhones, that teenagers, when they hit this kind of pubertal shift, it could be 12, it could be 13, and it carries basically through 21, they have an inability to fall asleep early. So the kids who were falling asleep at 7:38 as a toddler and then 8 to 9 as a school-age kid cannot go to sleep early. And so if they're going to sleep as late as 10:30 or 11, but we're making them get up at 5:30 in the morning because school is starting at 7:20, they are not getting the amount of sleep they need. And that is where the sleep deprivation comes from. And that is really based on this melatonin. And so there's a shift in melatonin. And ultimately, there's a 2 to 3 hour shift in what their natural bedtimes are. And it's not just the quantity of sleep. So we know it's 5 to 6 hours of sleep. But the other thing, and this is a little bit of a complicated graph, but if you look at, you go through sleep cycles, and when you look at REM sleep, and REM sleep is really where you get that restorative sleep that helps for psychological well-being. The majority of REM sleep is here. Hopefully you could see my cursor, but there's an arrow here. It happens towards the end of the night when you're getting to like 6 hours plus. Here's where a lot of this REM sleep is coming in. So when we're shortening the amount of sleep they get, not only are they not getting the right quantity of sleep, they're missing out on that REM sleep that happens towards the kind of end of their 8-hour sleep cycle. This is what you need to go to sleep. But here's a nice graphic of what happens here of this phase shift. So this is where you as parents or administrators are normally feeling like it's ready, you're ready to go to sleep. And in adolescence, they physiologically have this shift. So again, telling them to go to sleep early is, it's like telling you to go to sleep at 7 o'clock. You might be tired, but it's really difficult to fall asleep. And all of that science really leads to this, which is every organization who has looked at this has kind of bought in and made a recommendation that this is what schools should be doing. So this is, all of us who are here have no ulterior motives. We're not paid, we're volunteers, and we are here. And there is really, it's rare that you get science where there is no oppositional kind of scientific body we're saying the evidence supports something differently. Everyone is in agreement. This is a biological issue, and that the evidence really supports that we should be doing this. And that's where we were over the last decade. Why are we kind of cresting now, as I said before, just in terms of kind of support both nationally and throughout the state? And it's because not only was there theory, but there is data to support this. So we now have evidence to support that this actually works, that when you switch the school start times, kids sleep more, and that all the benefits that we talked about actually get realized. And here's one that just summarizes all the positive impact on athletics and kind of the difficulties of athletics when you have sleep deprivation. And right before, California is the first state that passed a law about this. This is last year in January of 21, there was a summit where they looked at all the research and just helped to plan for the implementation across the state. And there is a really nice kind of, this is the article, summary article of all the evidence. So on that, let's get right into it and utilize our time wisely and talking about what the obstacles are. So Jess, Ken, and Mike, if you guys could turn your cameras back on and unmute, let's really start talking. And this will be kind of somewhat unstructured. I have a bunch of points I want to go through, but let's get through the biggest one first. So the first one is transportation. So I opened up by saying, this was a problem that was created to solve a transportation solution. Districts got bigger. They only have so many buses and bus drivers. And so instead of one route, you had to take that same bus and bus driver and run them twice. And now in many districts throughout New Jersey, focusing on that, there's a lot of, they have 3 tiers and they use the same amount of buses and run those bus routes 3 times. It is, to me, it seems like you cannot solve this problem without addressing transportation. And some people will say transportation is a non-solvable issue. Let me open it to you guys. What are your thoughts on transportation and this school start times?
Yeah, I will say that became at Radnor, and I apologize if my internet seems to be going in and out, but you guys can hear me all right?
Yep, you're good.
At Radnor, this is the 4th year we've had it in place, that we've had a later start time at our high school. It did involve adjusting at the elementary and middle school as well. We didn't do the traditional flip. We wound up pushing the elementary a little bit later and pushing our middle school a little bit earlier in order to get the full hour at the high school. But transportation became the biggest, I would say, obstacle out of all the obstacles for us. And I know the obstacles are going to be individual to each district, but it became a problem-solving activity, became a large puzzle that thankfully I had a director of transportation and a principal who were willing to problem solve, were willing to, literally create, maybe it was 50, probably 100 different versions of what if we did this? What if we moved this? What if we adjusted this way? We didn't know what we didn't know about transportation until we really dove deep. We put together a team. I brought in substitutes for the transportation department to help lead the transportation department, while the director and the router and the high school principal locked themselves in a room for 2 days. And I kept coming in going, what if this, what if that, how about if we change this? So I think transportation it's a problem solving activity that you can overcome, but it takes time to do that.
And Mike, you just implemented this year. What was your thought on transportation?
I agree 100% with what Kenneth said. I think transportation is the obstacle. It's the biggest one. It's the dragon that you have to try to wrestle to the ground with a tiny little sword sometimes. And I had a similar experience as what Kenneth just described. I just kind of sat down and tried to come up with different scenarios, different routes, different start times. For context, we don't own any school buses in my district. All of our transportation is contracted out. So we are reliant on a provider for our transportation. We ultimately did what Kenneth did, and our routes are triple and double tiered. So we don't have really a lot of wiggle room. We can't just start the schools all at the same time. So we wound up moving our high school start time 40 minutes later. We kept our middle school time in place, which is an 8 a.m. start time essentially. And then we pushed back all of our elementary schools from 8:35 to 8:55. So they went later instead of earlier. We didn't do the flip. That didn't seem to be something that most of our parents, it seemed, really would have supported. Like everyone wants to get a little bit more sleep and have a less hectic morning. Nobody wants to be the one who's getting out of the gates at 7:30. So that's how we managed the transportation. And then, of course, we had many conversations and run-throughs with our transportation provider to ensure that they could accommodate what we wanted to do. And the breakthrough, I alluded to this in my opening remarks, the breakthrough for us was that we shrank the high school day by 15 minutes. So by taking 15 minutes out of the high school day, we were able to make the transportation work and actually improve the amount of time between bus runs. So our transportation this year is actually functioning better than it has in prior years because there's more time in between routes. And a big part of that is that we reduced the length of the high school day.
That's great. And Jessica, do you remember anything from your experience at Princeton that you think is relevant?
Sure. And you have to acknowledge that transportation is probably a bigger issue now than it ever was with the shortage of drivers. And it depends if your school has their own fleet or not. But I will say that in Princeton, we met as a committee. The principal led the committee. I was part of that committee. We made recommendations to the superintendent, who then worked with both our director of transportation and our sending district on a time. And the time changed based on what would work best with transportation and getting contracts. I also want to say you may or may not be in a district that's going to go later for the high school, and you might change other schools and you might not. So in Princeton, the high school went later, but we did not touch the elementary or middle start times. But what we did was we combined busing. So the high school and the middle school shared busing. So that was how we got around transportation, and it made it a little bit better. In my current school district, we have our own buses. So transportation, it's still going to be a concern, but it might be less so than if you're in a district that has to, have a contract with a company.
Thank you. And you know what, I think everything you said seems very relevant. And to some who are watching this, I don't think, if you're hoping for the answer, I don't know that we could give you the specific answer for your district. I think that what I hope you get out of this is, I remember a transportation consultant had told me once that there is a solution, there is a cost-neutral solution to every one of these transportation problems. How much you like the cost-neutral solution, what gives, what you move through. And I think that the concept that, like, both Ken and Mike had said about so many different variations, like you tinker and you look at them, that is really what I think it takes to solve this. And when they're looking at this, sometimes boards of eds, in New Jersey, often we'll hear that there's home rule, that we like people locally to make the decisions. There's a lot of decisions to be made by a board of ed here. There's no shortage of that. This is really about just saying, for high schools, what should be a minimum floor for starting, and most schools, it seems like, that have done this successfully have swapped high school and middle school, tried not to start middle school much earlier than 8, and not flipped the elementary and high school kids. So there's lots of solutions there, but I think it does take effort in that coordination.
And
so let's go to, yep, go ahead, Ken.
Before we leave transportation, just, a quote that we really use to guide us at the end is that, perfection, or being perfect, can't be the enemy of good. And I'm telling you, there is no district out there that has the perfect transportation schedule right now. And
Yep.
and we don't spend a lot of time. We just repeat a schedule that we have, and bus routes and runs, and they change over time. Our look at transportation also had an opportunity for us to lift some rocks that we hadn't in a district ever looked, and all of a sudden discovered there were some more efficiencies that we could be doing in some of our routes as well. In the district I was in previously, the same thing happened. All of a sudden, they started to realize that there was ways to do the routes more efficiently that hadn't had this type of attention in probably 50 years. So don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, because what we're doing right now prior to changing what we did wasn't a perfect schedule.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And I think, Mike even insinuated that as well, or actually said it, like his schedule now actually might run even better than it did beforehand. And, and a quick nod to like my home district and our superintendent in the moving towards changing school start times. There's a lot of push. We haven't got there yet in the big one, but they just looked at transportation and were able to find 25 minutes that they didn't need for the high schoolers. So they moved from 7:20 to 7:45 without changing anything, just by saying, hey, we haven't even looked at our transportation analysis. And very briefly, they were able to do that, hoping to move towards, a later school start time. But there's sometimes a lot of fluff in there just by spending the time looking at it that you can find. All right, so let's go to sports. What are your guys' thoughts on how changing school start times impacts sports?
Me to jump in first again, or I was going to look to Mike. I'll jump in again. So this was a challenge, and it does continue to be a challenge, as not all the districts in our area have changed. I know, with COVID, there was a bit of a pause put on these initiatives. I think many of the districts are now looking more closely at it. For us, what we did, again, it became a problem-solving activity. We wound up creating in our schedule a fitness class for athletes, we called it. So it was a gym class, and we put it at the end of the day, and we wound up hand scheduling those sports that had the most early dismissals. So when you really look at your sports schedule, you start to see that football is not the issue. Basketball plays a lot of games at night. That's not the issue. Wrestling is not the issue. It was sports like golf, tennis, became more of an issue for us with some of their after school events. And the opportunities we could ask other districts to have things a little bit later. So we created the Fitness for Athletes. That Fitness for Athletes, which was time intensive for scheduling. We had to schedule students that way. So that way they were missing their phys ed class if they had an early dismissal. But again, this school start time change made us also look at our entire physical education requirement now. Now, as I said, we're 4 years into this. We've moved away from the Fitness for Athletes, and we've wound up changing our physical education requirements for all of our students at Radnor, where we only have a requirement for physical education 1 year in Radnor, and the other years are elective years. And this gives our opportunity for all of our students to schedule hopefully a free period or lane in their schedule. So that was one way we dealt with it.
Thanks. And Jessica, what do you guys do at Princeton?
Well, when we changed to a later start time, sports were definitely a concern, but I don't think it outweighed what we knew were going to be the potential benefits. I will say with start with our schedule, we also went to a rotating schedule at the same time. Back then in our conference, we were already the later release time in our conference. So by pushing school back another half hour, our kids were used to getting out of school early, so they would lose instructional time. So what we did was we changed our schedule to a rotating schedule, so kids were not always missing the same periods each day. But I will say, with sports, we didn't have lights on our football field, so we never had, the evening games. It was more of a concern, I think, later in fall, early spring for sports. But I think we just got through it. We had community support at that time. We had student support, and we had a principal, athletic director, superintendent, who were really on our side with scheduling all of this. So it did not become our biggest obstacle.
Thanks.
Mhm.
And Mike, any thoughts on how that's impacting you guys?
Sure, I haven't lived through a full year yet, but we already have had a rotating modified block schedule in place for many years. And our athletic conference, we're located in Morris County, and so our athletic conference is kind of the whole northwest of New Jersey, which means that for many years now, we've had student athletes being dismissed from school early if they have an away contest that is either early in the day. For example, we have cross-country races today beginning at 2:40, or if there is a lot of travel involved. So we were already in the habit of releasing student athletes early at times. And now what's happening is because the school day ends 25 minutes later, they miss a little bit more time than they were missing before. We don't have lights on our field, so that's really not an issue. It's just primarily the away contests. We just did a quick check-in, like temperature check survey of our high school students. One of the questions we asked was, is this impacting, is your learning being negatively impacted as a result of the early release of student athletes? And by and large, it really didn't seem to be an issue among students. What we are hearing is for the handful of staff members we have who coach, because our schedule rotates and because students only play half of their contests away, they're not missing very many of the same class, right? They might only miss 3 or 4 classes a whole season, but our coaches, they're missing every time there's an away contest. So I'd say the challenge right now for us is just finding out how to manage that and ensure that our coaching staff is comfortable with leaving plans, making sure that their students are all up to speed when they're being released early. And that goes back to the notion of the pandemic and now having so many more resources online, much tighter Google classrooms and online resources in place for students, that it's easier for teachers or students to not be in school physically, but still keep a pace with what's going on in the classroom. And of course, it goes back to Ken's theme of don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If 1,200 kids are benefiting from more rest, but we have 3 or 4 teachers who are are inconvenienced by having to be dismissed early, or a handful of athletes who maybe missed a few more classes than we would have liked, the good is outweighing the downside there. So so far for us, that has not been a huge issue. We'll see when daylight savings, when we put the clocks back in a couple of weeks, if that changes things.
And we don't have our, because again, we're in the year 4, so many of our students now that we studied and we monitored through this change have now graduated and moved on. But I had several athletes talk about, and especially our runners, talked about the difference this change made on their athletic performance. The research is very clear. My experience is very clear. If you're, from my perspective, if you're a student who goes to bed at 10:30 or 11 or 11:30, whatever time you go to bed, you're going to go to bed that time, no matter what time your high school starts. So when we moved, just about everybody, and as we looked at it, we were getting an extra hour of sleep. That had a very positive impact, not only on the academics first period, but the athletics. It had a very positive impact on our athletic program.
Yeah, thank you, guys. And I'm going to hit 4 things on sports before we move on. One is, you guys talked about this. This really impacts away games, right? This is really not about home games. It's really not about practices. And so we're already talking about its impact for students often being a small subset. The second issue is, these days, we don't have very many 3-sport athletes. So often an athlete is participating in a sport in a given season. And so we're talking about making educational changes that benefit every student. And even if it was impacting sports, it is for a small amount of time. And then the third and the fourth thing, the third one is just organizing this, and the operational difficulties. A lot of those are made much easier. Like Jessica talked about, the athletic directors and interconference scheduling. If we do this across the board, it is that much easier. The discrepancy in ending time is kind of narrowed if everyone starts later. Actually, we're going to say 5 things. So the fourth thing is, as Mike had said, starting your day later does not mean you end your day exactly that much later, so you can shave some time. So often we're talking about really ending your school day 20-25 minutes later. That does not really change a lot of kind of calculations in sports. And the last thing, and I'm just going to move my slide back here, is this. Like, if we're really talking about sports, as Ken just said, if we care about sports, getting the kids adequate sleep will not only improve their performance, but decrease the amount of injuries. And so we know it decreases reaction time, being sleep deprived, and that increases the amount of concussions we see, injuries we see. And so if we want to focus on sports, and I am a member of the NJSIA's Medical Executive Committee, this is the slide that I would focus on, because this is really what we want to do for sports if we care about sports. All right, let's go back to schedule. So teacher-parent schedules, and this, I'll relate this on the next slide. There's one about teacher contracts. So how do you guys feel about this? Any thoughts on the relatively big umbrella topic?
I'll jump in again quickly. That I can say that, for our collective bargaining agreement here in Radnor, and we're in Pennsylvania, it did not stipulate the start time or the end time. It just stipulates the amount of hours. So it was not a contractual issue for us, but it was an issue we had to share with our teachers about how this would impact them. It forced us to collaborate, with them to say, okay, if we're going to make this change, when would be a good time to do faculty meetings? Do we want to continue the faculty meetings in the morning, or instead of the afternoon, have them in the morning? And those are things that we did. So we adjusted things. The high school staff preferred to still come in a little bit earlier, and this was, again, one of the changes that, I think probably the teachers were probably the most hesitant for the change as I looked at the community. Once we made the change, overall, this change has been, so supported by parents, kids, and teachers as well. Once we made the change, just like anything in schools, it's just, how do you get there? It's hard to get there.
Jessica, what was your experience at Princeton?
Well, we only changed the high school start time, and the specific start times were not listed in the contract. So we didn't have an issue with that. And because they're older kids, the schedules for the parents wasn't that much of an issue. Although I will say it did help, because a lot of our kids who are caregivers for their younger siblings, they were able to get their younger siblings on the bus and then get to school on time. So it did positively impact those students.
And Mike, how about yours?
I would say on the teacher side, similar to Ken, we didn't have really any contractual issues to work out. We were reducing the length of one of our work days at the high school, not increasing it, which would have been an entirely different story. We did have, because our elementary schools went from 8:35 to 8:55, we've moved faculty meetings to the morning. That was the preference of the faculties of the elementary schools. And historically, we've had a period of professional meeting time every Monday for an hour. The request from the teaching staff at the elementary level was, can we reduce that a little bit, because they had childcare concerns about being at school, late into the afternoon, which we have worked to accommodate. We kind of took the approach that there wasn't anything really specific to the contract that was problematic, but we wanted to collaborate and partner with our teachers so that we could work through some of these issues that might inconvenience them. On the parent side, I think what we've concluded is that you can't make every parent happy. Every parent has a different schedule depending on where they work, how many children they have, where they live, so on and so forth. And so there was nothing perfect about our previous schedule and the times of day. There's nothing perfect about this one. It has taken an adjustment. I know that we have like a before school and after school care provider here, a third party in district. They have faced the staff shortages that we've faced. They have trouble finding staff that they can utilize to provide the care. So that was, an unfortunate thing for us. It would have been better if they could have accommodated every request for before care, especially at the elementary level. They haven't been able to do that. So there are wait lists at some of our elementary schools, and our parents who are affected by that have had to make alternative arrangements.
Yeah, I think that's right on. Like this concept that any schedule is perfect for every family in town, and it's interesting to me as I've kind of gone around the state and just locally, where I'm a pediatrician in central New Jersey, and you look at the varying times of the district start, and you think nobody moved into a community knowing like with a promise that was the time, or like I'm going to live in this town versus this town because it's a 20-minute difference of school start times. And or as your child matriculates through, the school start time changes and you figure it out. On that note, outside of it always seems to be important to make sure that we're educating families about the why, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we hear anecdotally that people have concerns about childcare. Kind of, Mike, and you were alluding to this, and Jessica, you said it worked out in Princeton, but where they use the older kids to watch the younger kids, and that switching school start times changes that. I didn't hear any of you guys talking about that being a critical issue. Is that true? I just want to make sure that I bring that topic up.
It hasn't been a critical issue here that we've heard about. And I'll just note that the majority of our students participate in an interscholastic athletic activity, or some other activity like marching band or the performing arts, so on and so forth. So right off the bat, we knew, like, just as a floor, the majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority of our high school students were not available right after school to do much else, whether it was work or take care of younger siblings, because we know they're here. So I'm sure it is an issue probably for some, but that hasn't been part of the feedback that we've received in a prominent way.
Yeah, thank you. And, I think as you guys mentioned, all three of you, so Princeton didn't change their times other than their high school, and you guys switched high school and middle school. elementary is still kind of the lagging behind. So the concerns that I've heard have usually been the high schoolers watching the elementary school students. So in those settings, that the high schoolers were still being let out before the elementary school. So that wouldn't, the way you guys set it up, so it would not have impacted that. After school activities and impact on other stakeholders, my general belief, as I'm a school physician for multiple districts, and as I've watched this, it looks like the outside activities all circle around what the school does, and as the school changes what they do, everyone else adjusts. So that's generally been my belief. Is that your guys' experience?
100%. We reached out to employers, said if we start school later, and we did at our high school, when we pushed it later, what we did was we did find efficiencies during the school day. So it wasn't just we had to push it a full hour. We added time at the end of the day, but we also found some efficiencies during the school day. But we reached out to employers and said, what if kids were coming later? And not a problem. They would adjust.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so let's go to the next one. So we talked about teacher contracts already, and that is, I don't think we're in any situation we're talking about extending the amount of time in the day. And I think you guys all addressed this. Let me hit instructional minutes. So there's been a concern about if we shorten the day, do we lose instructional minutes? Sounds like you guys did not necessarily cut class time down as opposed to found other ways to shorten the day. But what are your thoughts on instructional minutes and whether or not that gets impacted by school start times?
We did cut class time.
Okay.
So I'll say a couple of things about this. The first is that I'm a former high school teacher, social studies and Spanish. And when I taught social studies and Spanish, each of my kids had a textbook, and they went home at the end of the day and they read a few pages and answered some questions. They were not logged into school after they left the school building. And what we've steadily and gradually done here in Chatham, and I'm sure everywhere else over the past 20 years or so, is we have increased instructional time after the school day, year after year after year after year. The whole notion of instructional time and seat time, the Carnegie unit of accruing time sitting in a school, is over 100 years old in concept. And the reality is, I think, in recent years, particularly at the high school level, also at the middle school level, but really at the high school level, is that we have increased the length of school day for students by expecting them to answer emails or submit assignments into Google Classroom or to log in to do some other type of work. So we've just added more and more time. And secondly, like if you look at a high schooler's day, if a high schooler comes into school at 7:40 a.m., school ends at 2:40 p.m., I've already said the majority of our kids are athletes or performers or involved in some other activity. They're here usually until close to 6 p.m. doing one of those activities. They get home and then they have about another 2 hours worth of homework on average. And we know that from the surveys we've conducted with our students. Our kids are pulling 12-hour days, day after day after day after day. I'm a 49-year-old superintendent. I had a 12-hour day yesterday because we had a board meeting last night. Today, I'm a little bit tired. We are doing that to our students every single day. And then we wonder why they're breaking down and they're having emotional problems and they're depressed and they're school avoidant and they're anxious. And it's not all the school's fault, obviously. There are many factors that are contributing to this. But we ask ourselves, what do we take away? How do we alleviate what is happening here? Or are we just feeding the beast? So I think that the whole notion of instructional minutes, we had 57-minute length periods, which we've had in Chatham High School since I was teaching there. We changed the periods from 57 minutes to 55. Right off the bat, 12 minutes we could take out of the school day just by doing that. And I can tell you as a former teacher in that schedule, in that building, our teachers easily can find the 2 minutes, because back in the old days, we used to check homework, not via Google Classroom, after school. But by walking around the room, row after row, looking to see if kids actually did homework, we took attendance that way, no more. There are just a host of ways in which we've become more efficient. Yet while we've become more efficient in school, we keep adding to what's going on after school. And then we ask ourselves, why are our kids struggling? So I think the whole idea of instructional time, it's one that I'd like to even press harder. Our high school day is still longer than our elementary school day. It should be the reverse. If you think about how much time kids sit in a class in college, it's way less than what you would expect, or what you should, what we're doing to our elementary kids. So we're going like in the reverse direction, in my opinion. And I think the pandemic has taught us that we can at least expect students to stay tuned, to stay plugged in and to keep on top of their work and be self-directed. They're going to need to be doing that after they leave us and leave high school. We can expect them to do a little bit more of that in high school if it leads to some relief in other areas. And I think there's more work I feel like we can do in our district to enable that to happen.
Thank you, Mike.
I was going to say, Michael, if there was a like button on that, I would have hit it a few times for you.
Me too.
Because you know what, you're right. It's not about instructional minutes. It's really about a humane schedule for our kids. And we will get so much more out of them if they're more well-rested. You talk about student engagement. It's not about the time in the class. It really is about the quality, how they feel about being in that class. Really, like I said, the conversation needs to continue. And if you need to shorten your day or to give add non-structured time in your day to make a later start time work with transportation, with sports, with anything, I think that has to be part of the conversation. I have tomorrow at my current school, we have a zero period, which is about an hour in the middle of the day where kids are not scheduled. And every single one of them finds a place, they're working, they're socializing. It's a very healthy practice. And I think it's just a way of treating our kids better. And so that is absolutely part of the conversation. And if you're just trying to preserve, the 7 hours and 1 minute of a school day that you've always had, and you're just moving your start time later and trying to preserve those minutes, I think this has to become part of the conversation that maybe we don't need all those minutes to make it work.
Thank you. Ken, anything to add to that?
I will just second and third what Mike just said. I agree with Jessica, and what Mike said was spot on. I would say that it was about 10 years ago, I think the book Race, or the whole study Race to Nowhere, came out when they interviewed districts and what are you pushing, and where I'm in a very suburban, high pressured school district where community expects a lot of our kids put a lot on themselves as well. While there are certainly kids that we are pushing too hard, there's certainly some kids that obviously might need to push themselves a little bit harder. There's always that nuance within every school district. But when I watched Race to Nowhere 10 years ago and saw that study about what we're doing to kids and what we're piling on, and there was an AP teacher who talked about how he changed his courses, and that was no longer giving as much homework and still having the kids score successfully on the AP exam. These studies of school start time and instructional minutes also become an opportunity for us as educators to look at what is it that we're doing with homework? How are we using homework? What are our instructional practices? And certainly everything that we've got the last few years comes into play as well.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I don't know that I could have liked any comments more. So I agree with you, Jess. We have about 7 minutes left. And we're basically going to be done. And I want to make sure I see questions in the Q&A, and we can always answer those and email them. But community surveys, I'll just put out there and you guys can tell me what your thoughts are. But I think it's helpful to survey communities when you need to find out, is you're trying to understand how to mitigate some of these issues. If you want to find out what their experience is with how much homework or times or after school activities. But I am biased against the concept of surveying people and asking their opinion about either health decisions or educational decisions. And I think that leaders should lead, take the data, make those decisions, and then educate the community about why you're doing it. Does that sound right to you guys?
Yes. Yeah, it sounds spot on. I am, instead of surveys, I think we should call them more questionnaires. It's good to get out there, get feedback. When we went through this, we held a lot of evening meetings. We never surveyed our community. We held a ton though of evening meetings, feedback sessions. We put an extensive Q&A up on our website. Every time we got a question, we answered and put it out there. But I think you got to be careful that a survey comes across as a referendum question, and it's worded the way you want to word it. It never, it is a challenge to do that. So I would agree 100% with what you just said.
Great. All right, so let's look down. So some myths I just want you to see. And so these are some misconceptions that administrators and parents might have. Kids need to go to bed earlier. We already said that they can't physiologically. If they have later start times, they'll stay up later at night. There's a ton of evidence that you get 30 seconds to a minute for every minute you delay school. And this comes down to part of this is educating them about why we're doing it. They need to dial down their tech use. Couldn't agree more with what kind of Mike had said, and then Ken would just said with the race to nowhere. I'd love them to limit their tech use from social media, but I'd also love to limit the amount of the burden of work that we give to them, and that getting up early is good prep for the real world. One of the great analogies I heard is it's like telling a toddler or 2-year-old, you shouldn't take naps because you're not going to be able to nap in kindergarten. So, they're physiologically, they're not ready for it. We can't make them ready earlier. And this really, hoping that anyone who listened understood that we're attacking this as a public health issue, because this is, as of right now, for students who are going to school districts that they start early, they are almost definitely sleep deprived, and that is negatively impacting them. And, I give a ton of kudos to the 3 of you guys for everything that you have done, because it really does take leaders and champions to move the needle on this, and that every day we don't do it, we're doing harm by letting the kids continue to suffer through this. And Senator Portantino, who is the California senator who was the champion of the bill there, you could see this here, but what he really was saying is, like, again, there is a floor. We need to say that there is, from a health perspective, a minimum time that we should not start school before that. That's all we're saying. Everything else could be left up to all the bright administrators, Board of Ed people to figure out how to implement it. Hopefully today's discussion gave you some kind of clues, and that A, it's possible, and B, how you might do it on your own. As questions might come up, here is our emails, and our panelists very graciously said that they're happy to answer questions, happy to take positive feedback, and any nasty things you could just send to me, leave them out of it. More resources for you, and this is here. We're going to send this out, but the webinar on the why is here as well. And I want to thank Marcella and Brittany, who are our New Jersey AAP kind of coordinators, who really helped put these slides together for me. And if we have another 2 minutes, Marcella and Brittany, are there any questions in the chat that you think we didn't hit that you want us to address in the next minute or two?
Bert, I do see a lot of specific questions here that might be better for us to email to Jess, Ken, and Mike afterwards and have them answer. Concrete data about the start times that they had before and then after the change, the costs for transportation changes, those sorts of things. So maybe it's better for us to just, get your answers and then share them with everyone. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
And I'm always happy, so many superintendents throughout my career and colleagues have supported and helped me that I know there's a lot of administrators on this call. I am happy for somebody to reach out and talk by phone or Zoom. Be happy to do that.
All right. And thank you. So a huge thanks to you guys. So Ken, Mike, Jessica, thank you for leading the charge and being champions, and thank you for sharing your time here today. Thank you to Marcella and Brittany, and thank you to all of you guys who tuned in to kind of listen in, and hopefully we'll make a change either locally or nationally, or we're hoping New Jersey on a statewide level make some changes. So we'll see over time, but thank you to everyone for your help.
Thank you.